All right. Okay, so are we all set to get going?
We are, Wendy. Welcome, everyone, to Forest Management and Carbon with Wendy Scribner and Matt Kelly. I am delighted to introduce Wendy and Matt tonight. UNH Cooperative Extension Natural Resources Field Specialist Wendy Scribner provides research-based natural resource information and assistance to a wide range of clientele, including private landowners, licensed foresters, members of logging and forest products industry, municipalities, schools, and organizations. She specializes in forestry and wildlife. She provides assistance and information on topics, including managing woodlots, selling timber, enhancing wildlife habitat, controlling invasive plants, and improving forest health and productivity. Wendy is a licensed forester in both New Hampshire and Maine and holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in forestry from UNH. UNH Cooperative Extension Forestry Field Specialist Matt Kelly earned his master's degree and PhD degrees in forest resource management from SUNY College Environmental and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. Prior to joining UNHCE, Matt served on the faculty at Michigan Tech University, where he taught courses in forest and natural resources management, timber harvesting, and forest management plan development. His research has focused on a range of topics, including forest policy and economics, family forest owner attitudes and behavior, and logging operation efficiency and environmental impacts. As a Cheshire County forester, Matt works with private landowners to deliver programming and technical assistance. He also works with conservation groups, consulting foresters, and agency partners throughout the county and the state. Thank you, Wendy and Matt. It is so wonderful to have you here with us tonight.
Okay,
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deb.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, tonight's program is Forest Management and Carbon. My name is Wendy Scribner, and really pleased to have Matt Kelly here from Cheshire County, and really appreciate his help in gathering the information for this presentation. And I also need to note that a lot of this information also came from Dr. Alexandra Kasiba from UVM Extension. And so with that, we'll get started. And so, first question is, why are we worried about carbon? And you've likely all seen this chart before, or something similar, where the blue line represents the increase in carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustion. You can see it start to increase at the late 1800s and really ramp up beginning around 1950. The orange line that you see here is the global atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. And you can see that those global concentrations are rising as well. And right now there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than any time in the last 800,000 years. As we know, that carbon dioxide traps heat in our atmosphere and leads to a number of different climatic impacts. So the good news is we also know that trees can help mitigate climate change by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing carbon in wood and soil. So, back to junior high days when you were learning about photosynthesis, the trees taking in carbon dioxide and water along with nutrients to fuel their own growth. So they're taking in the carbon dioxide. They do lose some carbon dioxide or emit some carbon dioxide through the process of respiration, where they're using the energy that they created to survive. And we also see losses of carbon through decomposition as well as combustion when we have wildfires. But overall, this is the basic forest carbon cycle. So just to give a brief snapshot about New Hampshire's forests, we have 4.7 million acres of forest land in New Hampshire. We're 82% forested, second most forested state in the country. Looking at the colors on the map here, the forest types, the orange represents our northern hardwood forest, which is our beech, birch, maple forest. Nearly half of our state falls into that pale green color that you see on the map, the hemlock, hardwood, pine. About 13% of our forest is in spruce and fir, those bright greens in the northern part of the state. And then in the southeast third of the state, you see a more southern forest type of Appalachian oak pine. I also like to say our forests are middle-aged in general. The majority of our forests are anywhere from 70 to 100 years old based on past land use and harvesting history. And looking at these charts here, you can see the different size classes of trees within each county. And the green bars, which are the biggest bars here, represent large diameter trees. Those are trees anywhere from 9 to 10 inches in diameter and above. The blue represents medium diameter trees. So those are like 5 to 9 inches in diameter. And then the smaller diameter trees, less than 5 inches, are represented by the yellow. And the thing to note here is other than Coos and Grafton County, which have some more younger forests, most of the forests across the state are in this larger size category, which is a good thing if you're thinking about carbon storage, because those larger trees are able to store more carbon. When we look at how we are growing trees versus how we're harvesting trees, we are growing twice as much wood fiber as we are harvesting. So if we distribute all of this growth and harvesting across the landscape, we are growing about 1/2 cord per acre per year of wood in our forests, and roughly harvesting about 1/4 cord per acre per year. So again, good things in terms of sustainability, sustaining our forest resource. Our forests are considered a carbon sink. So they are absorbing carbon dioxide. While there are small levels of emissions, the amount of sequestration that is happening in our forests far exceeds those emissions. So in 2018, our forests sequestered about 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or an average of a little over 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. And in doing so, these trees are offsetting about 33% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. It's not all good news when it comes to our forests. Our forests are facing a number of stressors. A recent study found that nearly 40% of our forest land is considered to be in a degraded condition, and to be understocked when it comes to species desirability and tree form. And so past harvesting history is responsible for a lot of this. We're looking at what we'd call a high graded stand in this picture. And high grading is basically when a landowner takes out all of the best quality, healthiest trees, harvests those for the income, but then leaves the poorer quality trees to continue to occupy the site. So when we think about climate change in our forests, there are really two sides of this coin to talk about. The first is that our forests are a natural solution to fighting climate change. But at the same time, they're also vulnerable to the changes that we're seeing or the effects of climate change. And how well they succeed in the future is going to depend on how adaptable they are to changes in our climate. So we have this great research forest here in Thornton, New Hampshire, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. And since the mid-1950s, they have been collecting climatic data. So it's close to home, and it's a long-term data set. Some of the things that they've found to date is that our average annual temperatures have increased 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century. Winters have warmed more than our other seasons, or an average of 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Days of snow cover, snow depth, and the amount of water held in our snowpack have significantly declined since they began measuring in the mid-1950s. And this lack of snow increases the frequency and the depth of soil freezing, which can damage roots, increase nutrient losses, and decrease forest productivity. So that's what some of the research has shown to date about how our forests are being influenced by climate change. There are also predictions based on different emission scenarios about what the future is going to look like related to climate change in forests. So the expectation is that growing seasons will lengthen. Again, temperatures in the winter are expected to increase more than other seasons. The amount and timing of precipitation will change, and intense precipitation events will become more frequent. Our vegetation may face increased risk of droughts during the growing season, and we expect that certain insect pests and pathogens will increase in occurrence and become more damaging. And also many invasive plants and insects will increase in extent or abundance. So we know what some of these more extreme weather events have done in the past. When you think about the 1938 hurricane and the huge impact it had on our forests, resulting in a tremendous amount of timber that was salvaged, stored in ponds and water bodies around the state, and then used for the Second World War response. We had significant ice storms in both 1998 and 2008. And just several weeks ago, we had one of those heavy precipitation events that caused damage throughout the state. This photo is of here, right here in Madison. So talking about increased pests and pathogens, we're seeing better winter survival and expansion of hemlock woolly adelgid populations expanding north. This invasive insect came into New Hampshire around 2000, and it's been slowly creeping north. And I think for a while we've hoped that it would reach a northern boundary where our weather conditions would make it inhospitable for it to live. Just recently, we found hemlock woolly adelgid in both Conway and in Jackson. So these warmer temperatures, the lack of these real cold events is allowing the populations of this insect to increase and to expand its range. Also this past year, we found southern pine beetles in traps in both Ossipee and Madison. And previously, the historical northern edge of the southern pine beetle range was in New Jersey. So these are just some examples of these increases in pests and pathogens. And anyone that's been in the valley the last couple of years, you likely could not escape the presence of the spongy moth. We had 2 years of very heavy defoliation in the region. And really, this is the first time we've had significant heavy defoliation in New Hampshire in about the last 30 years. We have a virus and a fungus that helps to keep those populations in check. But we've had a number of really dry summers, particularly in the springs, that really reduce the effectiveness of that virus and that fungus. So we saw these large defoliation events due to the spongy moth. We're also expecting that climate change will cause some shifts in forest composition over time, making conditions more favorable for our southern species and less suitable for our northern species. And so, depending on their adaptability and how the habitat changes related to the different climate models, we're going to see some winners and losers based on the ability of these trees to adapt to those changes and new conditions. So there's some great information out of the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science. There's a link here that you can get to some fact sheets that talk about how the expectations for how different species are going to respond in these different geographic areas. So the one we're looking at here is that green area of northern forest. And you can see there are a number of different factors that they looked at to determine how these different species were going to fare based on different climate models, looking at their adaptability, abundance, whether suitable habitat will be available, the amount of that habitat, and then the capability of those different tree species to respond to the different conditions. That has been summarized in some of these fact sheets. And you can see based on the models and the information that they've pulled together about all of our different species, the expectation is that balsam fir is not going to do well under these different climate change models. Gray birch is not going to do well. Red pine, for example. At the other end of the spectrum, a lot of our oak species look like they're going to do pretty well as eastern white pine. Sweet birch also seems, or black birch seems like it's going to do well with increasing temperatures. So now I'll move on to talking about some of the science and management related to forest carbon. I do want to recognize that carbon storage is one of the ecosystem services our forests provide, but it's important to look at it along with the other ecosystem goods and services that our forests provide. So providing quality water, good water quality, recreation, timber production, wildlife habitat. We just want to consider all of these things when we're making management decisions to make sure that we're doing the best for all of those benefits that we get from our forests. So you may be wondering, well, how much carbon is stored in a tree? And it's actually a pretty easy equation. The carbon in our trees is about half of the dry weight of wood in those trees. So if we can figure out what the dry weight of a wood is, we can figure out how much carbon is stored in a given tree. So the trees themselves are not the only place where carbon is being stored in our forests. You can see here, we think mostly about the above ground live biomass in our trees as well, but carbon is also being stored below ground. The live roots are part of that carbon pool. Leaf litter is also one of those pools of carbon, along with dead standing wood and downed logs, large branches, that sort of thing. And most importantly, soil holds a lot of carbon. So often the terms carbon storage and carbon sequestration are used interchangeably, but they really are not the same. Maximum storage and maximum sequestration happen at different times during the life of a forest. So our carbon storage is the amount of carbon that's retained in the pool within the forest. And carbon storage typically is at its peak when our forests are old, meaning greater than 200 years old. So if we want to maximize carbon storage, we want to grow big old trees. But carbon sequestration, which is that process of removing carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, that sequestration peaks when our forests are a young to intermediate age, or around 30 to 70 years old. Those trees will still continue to sequester carbon, but that peak rate of sequestration happens when the forests are relatively young. And so when we talk about units for carbon storage is the amount of carbon in the forest at a specific given time. And that is measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. While carbon sequestration is that process or rate of carbon removed from the atmosphere, and that is measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. So here we have two sugar maple trees. One is 10 inches in diameter, one is 20 inches in diameter. That 10-inch diameter tree is able to store about 3/4 of a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, where that 20-inch tree is storing over 4 times as much carbon, or 4 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So here we're looking at how a forest develops over time, going from left to right. And again, you can see the maximum storage is happening as that forest is getting older. While maximum sequestration is happening in that younger forest, and that's when growth is very fast. The trees are trying to outcompete each other to survive. So they are putting a lot of height growth on trying to capture access to sunlight. And where carbon is stored in the forest, in these different pools, is different from where carbon is sequestered. So for storage, it's interesting to note that on average, 55% of the carbon in our forest is stored in the soils, with another 30% in the above ground biomass. While sequestration is happening primarily in that above ground live biomass. So you may ask, how much carbon is my forest storing? The average amount of carbon collectively in these different pools, when we're looking at forests that are averaging 80 to 100 years old in New England, is about 60 to 80 metric tons of carbon per acre. And so here you can see where carbon is being stored in those different carbon pools for a variety of different forest cover types. And the thing to notice here is that our oak pine and our white, red, and jack pine forests are able to store the most carbon per acre, while our aspen and birch is storing the least amount of carbon, somewhere in the vicinity of about 63 metric tons per acre. And so there are a number of tools that have been developed for people who are interested in looking at estimating the amount of carbon on their property. This is a page from the Main Tree Carbon Estimator, and there are tables for every 2-inch diameter class for this range of different species. And so if we look at the green bar here, you can see the weight of an average 14-inch white pine tree. The bowl is going to be about 80% of a ton, including the both total above and below ground. It's about 1.25 tons. We have factors in here to look at the water content of these different species, and we can use that information to determine the dry weight of all of these different species. Then looking at the amount of carbon, that 50% of that dry weight is considered to be carbon. We can find out that for that 14-inch pine tree, we have that represents about 0.38 tons of carbon, or about 760 pounds of carbon. And contrast that to a heavier species, say red oak. A 14-inch red oak tree is going to be storing about 0.597 tons, and that translates into about 1,200 pounds. So this can be a great tool if you're interested in finding out, how much storage there is on your own forest, how much carbon storage. Another way people are looking at this in Massachusetts, they're using basal area, which is a measure of tree density, and correlating basal area with predictions of how many tons per acre a forest will contain. So now we'll talk a little bit about different strategies to maintain and enhance carbon storage and sequestration in New Hampshire's forests. The first strategy, and probably the most important strategy, is to keep forests as forests. Deforestation causes the loss of that stored carbon, and then the land is not able to contribute to that carbon sequestration in the future. And at the same time, we lose the other ecosystem services that land in that forest is providing. And so organizations like the Chocorua Lake Conservancy and other land trusts that are working to put easements on property to keep forest as forest are really helping us to keep our forests intact and helping them to maintain the storage of carbon that they are providing now. And that's the biggest thing that we can do is keep those forests storing the carbon that they're storing now. In New Hampshire, we have been losing an average of 5,400 acres each year to development. And so in addition to losing that carbon storage, we're also losing the other benefits like habitat, clean water, and those sorts of things when we lose that land to development. Second strategy is to increase the resilience of our forests, increase species diversity. We know how some species are going to be more vulnerable to climatic changes and insect and disease problems. So maintaining that species diversity is going to help maintain resilient forests. Also increasing structural complexity. On our better sites, our trees can grow taller. And this means there's more carbon storage and sequestration for those trees, but it also allows for the development of different layers of understory vegetation. So a ground layer, a shrub layer, and understory trees. And this all allows for leaf surface area, which is going to help facilitate more photosynthesis. So increasing the structural complexity in our forests is another way to increase carbon storage as well as enhance resiliency. Strategy 3 is to increase the growth rates of our forests. This is best accomplished by thinning to increase the light and resources available to our best and healthiest trees. And while this may reduce carbon stocks in the short term, those trees are going to respond and take up that available growing space, that available access to sunlight, and quickly begin sequestering more carbon. Some of the trees, depending on when you do a thinning, may be trees that can be harvested and then turned into durable wood products that will still continue to store carbon. Or you can also consider just cutting those trees and leaving the wood in the forest where it can go back into the soil pool. And then strategy 4, balancing storage and sequestration. We have very little old growth in New Hampshire. I think it's less than 1% of our forest is in older forests, meaning greater than 200 years old. Most of our forest land has been harvested at some point in the past. We know that older forests are going to store more carbon. So you can identify areas on your property where you want to just let nature take its course and never harvest some of those trees. That's a strategy to increase carbon storage on your property. Thinking about inaccessible parts of your forest land that are, maybe you can access them, but it's going to be very difficult to get in and do a timber harvest. Maybe that area is better served by letting it continue to grow and just be impacted by natural processes. Also buffers around water features, having no cut buffers, allowing those trees to get old, to fall down, is another way to incorporate developing these old growth characteristics on your property. For those areas that you're managing, extending the rotation age to let those trees grow older, waiting on a harvest, giving it another 15 or 20 years to continue to grow, store that carbon, and sequester that carbon as it gets older. We saw in that chart that our forests are sequestering about a little over a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. So you think about that over 15 years that you decide to hold off on harvesting, that can be a significant contribution to carbon storage and sequestration. And I just want to make a note on old growth forests. Our typical forests, these secondary growth forests or middle-aged forests, as I call them, they were storing 60 to 80 metric tons of carbon per acre. While the estimates are that old growth forests can store anywhere from 100 to 120 metric tons of carbon per acre. So there is a great opportunity for these secondary growth forests, if we let them grow older, to capture and store more carbon per acre. And at the same time, we do want to balance that storage and sequestration. We don't want, the 80% of our forest that is getting older to all go to old growth, because when we think about as trees age, they accumulate stressors. Maybe a drought this year, an insect defoliation event the next year, injury, all of these things can stress a tree and eventually lead to mortality. So we don't want to have a huge swath of forest that is all reaching these older ages with these vulnerabilities. So trying to incorporate some young forest into our forests, young forest sections into our forest will help, again, improve that diversity and improve that balance of storage and sequestration. So here you can see a young forest developing, quite a bit of diversity here in terms of tree species. And this is a very important habitat for a lot of wildlife, particularly birds. Many of our birds, while they may live in our more mature forests, they're going to seek out these younger forests. That tree diversity is leading to a lot of insect diversity. And so a lot of our bird species are going to key into these young areas where they can find a lot of insects to feed their young. So both a carbon benefit of having this diversity as well as a wildlife benefit. And then multi-age or uneven aged management can be used to help balance storage and sequestration. The picture on the lower left corner here is of a group selection harvest that was done on the Bartlett Experimental Forest. And you can see that the forest itself before this harvest was a pretty consistent age and size. So this harvest went in and took out groups of trees anywhere from 1/4 of an acre to 2 acres in size. It's allowing those patches to develop into young forest while it's keeping a lot of the existing older forest intact for carbon storage. So this can be a way that you can balance that storage and sequestration. And there are a number of different harvesting practices that you can use to create that diversity of age classes. And then lastly, managing for durable wood products. So here we have some red oak lumber. Red oak is a very valuable wildlife species for the acorn production for our wildlife. If we can grow big old trees that produce a lot of acorns, that's great while they are storing carbon in the forest. When they're harvested, turning them into lumber that is then going to have its own storage for decades or even centuries in its lumber form is another way to enhance the storage capability of our forests and forest products. Some other considerations: protecting the soil carbon pool, using best management practices, minimizing soil disturbances, working with professionals when you're laying out skid trails and landings, using comprehensive timber sale contracts to clarify conditions when you expect work to shut down because of wet conditions, soft soils, that sort of thing. And where it's appropriate, harvesting on frozen ground can help protect that soil carbon pool. And then maintaining that deadwood pool, leaving those dead standing trees where they're not a safety hazard, leaving the downed logs in the harvest during a timber sale. For the most part, there's no economic value to taking them out, so they're better left in the forest. And as it's appropriate, leaving the tops, branches, and unmerchantable log segments in the forest to allow those wood resources to decompose into that soil carbon pool. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was carbon markets. And a carbon market is where businesses can purchase credits to offset their carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where landowners can undertake specific projects to increase their forest's ability to absorb carbon dioxide and store carbon. So there are 3 main categories of actions for forest carbon offsets. One of them is avoided conversion. Carbon offsets are generated when you prevent the conversion of forest land to a non-forest use. There are also carbon offsets for afforestation and reforestation projects. So tree planting, either following a harvest, or on land that is not currently forested. And then the last category is improved forest management to increase the level of carbon storage over time. Very briefly, there are two types of carbon markets. There's the compliance or regulatory market, where emitters of greenhouse gases are required to reduce their emissions, but can often purchase some carbon offset credits to account for the emissions that they are making of CO2. And then there's the voluntary market. And this is where you have companies that are conscious of their carbon footprint, and they may want to be able to tell their customers that they are carbon neutral. And so they may look to purchase carbon credits as a way to offset some of their activities that contribute to a carbon footprint. And I'll just mention there's a lot of different terminology and different levels when you start looking at the carbon markets. And currently there are several programs out there that are now available for people who have smaller forest parcels. For a long time, it was really only feasible to look at these carbon offset projects if you had 2,000 acres or more. Now there are a number of groups, particularly with this voluntary market, that are looking at developing projects or programs for people with smaller acreages. I can't speak to any of these particular programs and whether they are available in the region or not, but if it's something that you're interested in, there's definitely good information that you can find at the Securing Northeast Carbon website that I'll show you in a little bit. One program I will mention, this is not an endorsement of the program, but it's a little bit different than some of the other carbon offset programs. It's called the Family Forest Carbon Program. And this was developed by the American Forest Foundation in cooperation with the Nature Conservancy. And rather than pay for the carbon itself that's being stored, this program pays landowners to implement practices that will store carbon. They're just beginning to roll this program out here in New Hampshire. I think they're going to do that in the fall. Right now, though, it is only working in the northern hardwood forest type. But if carbon storage and sequestration is of interest to you and you have northern hardwood forests that meet their criteria, this may be something that you want to explore. I also want to mention the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. Many of you may be familiar with the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, that helps to cover the costs of management plans as well as a variety of different forestry practices. They also have a series of climate smart agriculture and forestry mitigation activities that they will provide cost sharing assistance for. Again, I just learned about this recently, so I don't have a lot of information to share about it, but you can check it out online, talk with your NRCS person in your county. Apparently, this program is a different pool of money available for climate-related projects. But you would access it the same way that you do through the EQIP program. A point I really want to make is that these markets and incentives are rapidly evolving. If you're interested in exploring them, I encourage you to research all of the different programs that are out there that might benefit you and your objectives. But I'd also caution you to not get enrolled in one too quickly to only find out that precludes you from getting involved in another program that may be coming down the line in the future that may better meet your needs. So it's kind of it seems like a wild west out there. There are a lot of programs that are being developed, and it's worth doing some research on what's out there, what may be coming down the line in these programs. Last thing I'll just talk about, because in the news you may hear questions about carbon offsets. Are they really doing any good? That sort of thing. And so some of the things that they look for in these carbon credit programs is, one of them is additionality. You have to be able to show that the actions that you're taking are storing more carbon than you would have stored without taking those actions. You have to be able to measure and verify that you have been able to store that carbon. Typically, these agreements are long-term agreements, often 40 years or more. The Family Forest Program, I believe, is a 20-year commitment, but they are long-term agreements, so that to ensure that the carbon isn't released too quickly. And there has to be enforceability, so that you can't use offsets more than once, or collect payments for the same activity through different programs. And so if we look at this idea of additionality, if we look at a forest that is here on the y-axis, and under normal circumstances, you might consider harvesting that forest, letting it regrow, and then harvesting it again, letting it regrow and harvest it over time. An example of additionality would be that you forego that first harvest, you grow that timber, you get out to the point of your second harvest, you harvest, and then you continue to let that forest grow. All of the space between these two lines is additionality and carbon that you have gained by taking that different action. And I just want to mention that there are a number of different resources out there where you can find out more information about these different carbon programs, about some of the expectations or predictions related to climate change, and enhancing storage practices to consider for enhancing storage and resiliency. And again, I'd highly encourage you to check out this Northeast Forest Carbon website. This was put together by the Northeast State Foresters Association, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. And you can see a number of different categories they have here for resources available. They have a number of webinar recordings, some of them specific to some of these different carbon programs. So it's a way for you to get information about the requirements and expectations of these different programs. Key takeaways. The best way to maximize carbon dioxide storage in our forests is to keep them as forests. Our older forests store more carbon than younger forests, but they sequester carbon at a lower rate. And maintaining age and structural diversity within the forest and across the landscape is the best way to maximize storage and sequestration, as well as to provide for climate resilience and wildlife habitat. And with that, I will open things up for questions. Okay.
Hi, folks. Anyone checking the chat? And I'm not seeing any questions right off.
Is anybody still awake?
Thoughts or ideas, additions, commentary?
I'll just add
Okay.
a couple of comments if there are no questions. First, Wendy, that was
Great.
awesome job. Really well done. I want to just make a mention about the harvested wood products because,
Yeah.
you know, one of the areas that people are talking a lot about with the carbon market programs is, you know, Wendy mentioned additionality as, you know, something that we need to make sure is there. But another concern is this concept of leakage. And because some of these programs, you can do improved forest management where you're still managing, but you're just doing it a little bit differently. Or you can just say, I'm not going to harvest at all. We call that deferred harvest. And while that's great for that stand or that property, it doesn't stop the demand for wood products. It just says those wood products are not going to come from here. So it's an important thing to think about, because if we start saying, well, we're not going to harvest any trees, we're really just pushing the timber harvesting activity off of our property, and that demand is going to come from somewhere else. The other thing I'll mention is there's a lot of interest and work being done to actually increase the use of wood for building materials, cross-laminated timber, mass timber structures, as a substitute for concrete and steel, which are much more, you know, have a much bigger carbon footprint. So there's a lot to think about in terms of, you know, managing and whether or not to cut a tree and what is the end destination and use of that tree. Yeah, so I just want to mention a couple of those things maybe to get the ball rolling. Looks like someone does have a question though.
I think I can take that one, Matt. Thanks, Lita, for the question. You've asked, great presentation. I'm curious what opportunities have been discussed by, for CLC. Alex and I recently attended a climate change workshop with the Nature Conservancy and at Tin Mountain, and we made a plan for one of our properties, and we've discussed different options that we could use. Certainly NRCS, the CSP program, is an option that we can use. They have climate smart practices, storage practices that we're looking into. And I think a lot of our properties in general, as far as storage, are definitely storing a whole lot of carbon. Some sequestration practices we've used are early successional habitat management on a lot of our properties, and selective cuts and openings as well. So we are definitely dabbling into the climate change and carbon sequestration and storage areas on our properties and management for that. Okay, looks like there's another question. As climate change increases, the risk of wildfires, and there are new programs being developed to prevent fires, which reduce carbon storage to zero in a moment. Can anyone comment on that, or?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. You know, certainly getting wood cut down and in contact with the ground speeds up that decomposition. So it's in terms of fire risk, it's good to have that wood in contact with the ground. That's going to keep it moisture, and then allow it to enter that carbon storage situation. As far as cost share practices go, I don't know though. And that's certainly, you know, something that I'm getting more questions about when I visit with landowners is concern about wildfire risk. And, you know, I think with any of these activities that you're going to undertake on your own property, you know, maybe you leave that material on the ground, if you're doing forest improvement work, get it in contact with the soil, but maybe that's a certain radius around your house. You say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to remove that material, as a way of dealing with wildfire risk. I know out west, there's a lot of discussion about how we can reduce those fuel loads, but I don't know that there are any programs specifically out there to address that topic.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that one too. So I think you got to think about what the context is of the forest and its particular risk at the moment. And I'm thinking about that spongy moth defoliation that's happened for 2 years. If we see mass mortality of standing dead trees, those dead trees are drying out, that is a much bigger risk of a major fire happening. So in that context, what I would advise a landowner or suggest as an opportunity to both help with the mitigation of the fire risk and also maybe put a little money in their pocket is to do the salvage logging to get those trees, put them into durable hardwood products that will continue to store carbon in those products, and then hasten the recovery and the regeneration of that forest rather than having a whole bunch of dead, highly combustible material just sitting out there waiting for a lightning strike. So it's a little bit situational dependent. Whenever we talk about wildfire, the risk of wildfire in New Hampshire and the Northeast is not zero, but it's definitely not like it is out west. I mean, and one thing that they've learned out west is through decades of fire suppression, they've made the situation worse because fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. And when you don't allow fires to burn and you are constantly putting them out, and mostly this, I'm talking about out west, you allow those fuels to build up and build up and build up. And then when a big fire comes, they're catastrophic. And so you have fire suppression as a policy in the West for many decades, which was pretty misguided. Everyone agrees at this point, adding to the severe drought conditions fueled by climate change. And then you have pine beetle kill. And so you have a lot of things that are happening out west that are much different than in the East. But that's what I'll add to that.
That's right, Matt. A lot of times they call the eastern forest the asbestos forest because of all the humidity and rain that we get. I've heard that term float around quite a bit. We have a few
here too, which is, I'll just say, is a little bit of a dangerous term because, again, the fire risk is not zero. It's just that it's much less than what we see in the news.
Absolutely. Agreed.
And I would just add, if we look at our historical wildfires, they have typically been after a large event that created a lot of slash. So the early 1900s with the logging in the White Mountains, followed by a lot of wildfires that were, triggered not only by lightning, but by trains that were taking that wood out. The 1947 fires that were big throughout New Hampshire and Maine were utilizing a lot of slash that was down on the ground from the 1938 hurricane. So that dead material is definitely something that we need to be aware of with fire risk.
Okay, we have a few more questions in the chat. These are kind of hitting closer to home. Folks are concerned about burning wood. The next question is, this might not fit, but when we burn wood in our wood stoves, etc., what effect does that have?
Well, you are releasing that stored carbon. The question really is, you're going to need to heat your house some way. And so how does using that wood and releasing that carbon compare to using natural gas, using oil, using wood pellets, that sort of thing? So that's really you are going to be releasing carbon, but realistically, you're probably, to generate heat, going to be releasing carbon in some way, shape, or form. So the question is, is this a better alternative than what I would do otherwise?
And I'll just chime in. The research that I've seen is that if we all in New Hampshire switch to heating our homes with wood or wood pellets, that would be a net climate benefit. Where we get into power plants, and it gets pretty, the accounting of it gets challenging because there are assumptions that need to be considered. So if say, for example, you heat your home with wood that was harvested to convert to a Walmart parking lot, that would have to be considered into that calculation. In contrast, if you're removing the poorly formed trees and that thinning operation that Wendy talked about to make room for growth of your best trees that are going to sequester carbon for many more years, then that's a great benefit. So when you get into the accounting of carbon and heat and energy, it really matters where you determine sort of your system boundaries to analyze. But overall, all the research I've seen is that heating your home with wood is a better outcome than heating with oil.
Okay, thanks so much. I think that kind of wraps up the next question, Alex. I'd answer that for you. Alex is heating with pellets, and I am too. And I'm happy to know that we're doing one of the most ecologically sound practices to heat our homes. Our next question is from Kathy Stark. Hi, Kathy. She says, I'm all for storing carbon, but if we think globally and act locally, isn't it better to harvest here and diminish harvest in the rainforest areas? Also, how does tree decomposition in an offset area compare to a clear cut regenerating and soaking up carbon? So multi-phase question.
Yeah. I think that question about harvesting here versus harvesting in the rainforest, we have a lot of environmental controls here. So we can, we have timber harvesting laws that are going to govern, protecting streams, protecting water quality, that you don't see necessarily in a place like the rainforest. And so I think here in New England, we have a good opportunity to provide for some of the demand that we create for wood products. And so I think, being responsible about that with our own resources is best case scenario. Moving, I don't know whether you have anything to add on that part of the question, Matt.
Yeah, I think the Kathy's point is a really good one. When he mentioned the regulations and the controls that we have because of our laws and our system in these tropical forests, they're more sensitive. They're sensitive soils. We have a very resilient forest. I tell landowners all the time, we can't stop trees from growing here, even if we tried. So that's a great thing. But I think the other thing to consider is that there's data that shows that we consume, as granite staters, more wood products than we harvest. So we are importing our wood from somewhere. The last thing I think about the rainforest is also, to Kathy's point, a lot of what we hear on the news is harvesting and clearing rainforests to convert for farm and agriculture. So that gets right back to that first and foremost thing, is just keeping forests as forest is the most important thing. Whether you clear cut them and let them grow, whether you thin them, whether you let them grow to old age, as long as it's going to be land that's used for forest, that's probably the best thing we can do.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
looking at I'll take a stab at the second part of the question, which is looking at tree decomposition and regenerating clear cuts. I think, if we have a clear cut, we talked about that sequestration really ramping up between the ages of 30 and 70 years old. In that the early days of that clear cut, there's a lot of sun hitting the forest floor. That's going to be speeding up some of the decomposition that's happening. So you may early on in a clear cut have more emissions than you do sequestration. And I don't really know how to compare that to the, the decomposition in an offset area. But early on following a clear cut, there will likely be, a period of time that there are more emissions than there is actual sequestration happening.
Okay, great. On to the next question. Do we do controlled burns to reduce fuels in New Hampshire? I could take a quick stab at that and say, yes, we do. We definitely do burns for habitat management, specifically in the Ossipee pine barrens, to manage for pitch pine and encourage growth of that. I know that also the U.S. Forest Service has done some burns on their properties to keep field habitats open. And it seems like maybe Wendy, you may have had an addition to that.
Yeah, definitely. We do some prescribed burning. The challenge here in New Hampshire is, there is a prescribed fire council, and there are lots of guidance in terms of what you need to have to implement a controlled burn. A challenge is having people trained to be able to do it. And, because of the safety considerations and the concerns about something, getting out of control, you need to have a lot of people involved. And also the window for getting that work done can be very narrow. I know for a number of years, there was interest in doing a prescribed burn, and we just didn't have, you're really looking at conditions of humidity, wind, a whole bunch of factors to make sure that you're going to be effective in your objectives for the prescribed burn, as well as not burning in really risky conditions. So we do, but we do have some, but it takes a lot of planning to actually get one implemented.
Generally, there's a certified crew that will go out with the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking we've come to the end of our questions. Oh, we got one more here. Our next question is, why doesn't New Hampshire have tree wardens or any ordinances in towns or cities? What worries me is the loss of big trees in our towns and cities where they are needed the most. People should be people should be rewarded for managing their large shade trees and monitored for cutting. How do we start protecting street trees?
It's a really good question. For those folks that are interested, one of the things that when people have concerns about potential hazard trees around their properties and things, you can go to the, I believe it's the iTree website, and you can actually put in information. You can put your tree on the ground where it is related to your house. And you can find out the environmental benefits that tree provides. And so that can be a great way for, particularly I think about people that have big ash trees on their property. And, we know the emerald ash borer is coming through. They're facing a decision of, do I treat this tree and continue to treat it every 3 years? Or do I have it cut down? And, if you're looking strictly at the costs, it's already a tough decision, when you're thinking about safety and hazards and all of that, but looking at all of those benefits that tree is providing, not only in terms of the carbon storage, but, energy that's not needed to cool that house because, that tree is providing shade and reducing temperature. So there are some sites that you can try to encourage people to look at all of those values that are associated with those big old street trees. But it's a tough call, particularly if people are concerned about a hazard near their house, so.
Okay. The next question is the National and State Forest Organization taking this information into consideration when forming forest management plans?
I'll take a stab at that. So yeah, I know that the state does. So their forest action plan has a whole section on for climate change and forest carbon, with a lot of the information, some of which might have been taken, that was presented tonight, that was taken straight from that document. And more and more. So we're also going to be rewriting there's a great set of guidelines called the Good Forestry in the Granite State that has everything from here's what you need to think about for managing for timber, here's what you need to think about for wildlife. And we're going to be adding a chapter on forest carbon and climate change in this next iteration, which is actually happening right now. So there's a lot of information coming out on this, and certainly the feds are integrating it. There's a lot of federal dollars through the Inflation Reduction Act that are going to be coming through the NRCS that are earmarked, for lack of a better word, for carbon or climate change mitigation. So there's a lot of and so much money so that the NRCS is have to figure out a way how to spend it all, which is a good problem to have, because it's a good, in my opinion, a good place to be, investing.
Okay, great. I think Juno, I see, has put the link for our walk on Saturday into the chat. And I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we're ready to wrap this up this evening. I wanted to thank Wendy and Matt again for joining us and for such an engaging, interesting presentation. And we will look forward to seeing you Saturday on the Forest Carbon Walk at our CLC